Genealogies are one of the most common literary genres found in the Bible, but if the comments on my history-related videos are anything to go by, they are also one of the most misunderstood, especially when the findings of historians and archaeologists present a view of history that clashes with a literal reading of the Bible. Part of the problem, I think, is that our modern assumptions about ancestry data and the purpose of genealogies can lead us astray when we read ancient literature, whether it's the Bible or some other ancient text. I hope to demonstrate in this video that the Bible's genealogies fulfill an entirely different purpose than modern family trees. I'll be focusing on Genesis chapter 10, which is often called the Table of Nations because it describes how all the nations of the world are descended from Noah and his sons. If you read this passage as a biblical literalist, like I used to be, you begin to wonder, why doesn't this passage mention China or India or the Incas of Peru or the thousands of other tribes and nations around the world? It might also occur to you that major civilizations like ancient Egypt were probably not founded by one guy with the same name. Tribal formation and nation building are complicated processes that involve the migration and societal development of many people over long periods of time. If we read the genealogy with the understanding of its original audience in mind, however, it takes on new levels of meaning and serves as a valuable source of information about the biblical world. It can also give us helpful clues about when Genesis was written. If you thought the Bible's lists of begats were boring, I hope I can convince you otherwise. Anthropologists have long known that tribal societies often use genealogies to express social and political relationships between tribes. A genealogy of that type doesn't say much about actual history. Instead, it reflects social conditions at the time it is composed, and it can be rearranged over time as the relationships between those tribes change. Over the past 2 centuries, religious scholars have come to realize that the Bible's genealogies often work the same way. Mario Liverani, in his well-known book on the history of Israel, explains that in the Iron Age, it was common for people to imagine that the name of their village came from the original ancestor of all the village's inhabitants. This fictional ancestor, after whom the village is supposedly named, is called the eponymous ancestor of the village. Over time, as multiple villages in the same region develop social and cultural links, they create an expanded genealogy in which their village ancestors are all related as sons of the same father. This father is also fictional, of course, and he becomes the eponymous ancestor of the entire tribe or nation. Liverani notes, such a genealogical model is clearly artificial. The villages and families involved were certainly related, not through a common origin, but through a long history of intermarriage. Their unity is therefore achieved by a process of convergence, not divergence. But the genealogical model is obviously more vivid and makes a stronger impact. Historian Jonathan Hall makes a similar point in his book on ethnicity in ancient Greece. As ethnic groups come into increased contact with one another, they may wish to find common ground through the metaphor of genealogy, which might anchor in a mythical past the supposed reasons for affinity in the present. In the Bible, we see this principle in action quite often in the Pentateuch and Chronicles, where the ancestors of small clans are depicted as the offspring of a larger tribe. The genealogy of Genesis 10 goes even further than most, as it endeavors to show how the nations of the entire known world are all related through a single patriarchal ancestor, Noah. As we dig into this text, I think it will become obvious that the names in this genealogy do not represent historical individuals. Rather, as the 19th century anthropologist Edward Tyler put it, they are the names of personified cities, lands, and races. Genesis 10 begins as follows. These are the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Children were born to them after the flood. It continues with a list of about 70 names representing various kingdoms, tribes, and cities that descend from Noah's 3 sons. Here is the genealogy arranged as a chart. The first thing to observe about the Table of Nations is that it seems to include names from at least 2 sources. According to Professor Guy Darshan of Tel Aviv University, the text contains contradictions, doublets, rough seams, and stylistic differences, which show that it originated as 2 separate genealogies grafted together. Most scholars, Darshan included, agree that these two sources are the priestly source and the Yahwist or non-priestly source. To learn more about those sources, I suggest you check out my videos on Noah's flood and on the plagues of Egypt. It's easy to see what Darshan means by doublets because some of the names appear twice. In verse 7, Havilah and Sheba are descendants of Ham and Cush, but they appear again as the offspring of Shem and Joktan. Lud also appears twice, once as a descendant of Shem and once as the Ludites who descend from Egypt. Asher appears both as a descendant of Shem and as a land settled by Nimrod, a son of Cush. Other differences in style and geographical focus will become apparent as I examine the genealogies in greater detail. The portion of the genealogy attributed to the priestly source has a very specific style. It uses a verbless formula that separates each person's offspring with the Hebrew equivalent of and. The priestly genealogy begins with Noah and proceeds through his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Their offspring form an orderly geographical worldview. The descendants of Japheth are the nations north of Canaan, stretching from Madai to Asia Minor and Greece. The descendants of Ham extend from Canaan southward to Africa and southern Arabia. The descendants of Shem are the nations around Mesopotamia and the northern Levant. The Yahwist table of nations. The Yahwist genealogy mostly uses the verb beget and the accusative marker. It focuses on the descendants of Egypt, Canaan, and Aber. Some scholars also assign Nimrod, son of Cush, to the Yahwist, while others view it as an independent story fragment. The Nimrod segment introduces other difficulties that I've already covered in an earlier video. Leaving Nimrod aside, we can make some basic observations here. The descendants of Egypt are all given as plural names. They are explicitly portrayed as tribes or nations, not as individuals. The mention of the Philistines presents a special problem that I'll come back to. The descendants of Canaan consist of Sidon and Heth, who represent the Phoenicians and Neo-Hittite states, followed by plural names that represent other groups in the Levant. Aber, who appears to be the eponymous ancestor of the Hebrews, is given two sons, Peleg and Joktan. 13 sons are attributed to Joktan. Some of these names are unknown, but the ones we can identify are locations in southern Arabia. It's a bit strange that nothing is said of Peleg's descendants here. Chapter 11, however, features a linear genealogy of Shem that goes through Peleg down to Abram and his brothers. It is significant that the traditional enemies of Israel, the Egyptians, Philistines, and Canaanites, are all grouped under Ham, whose descendants are placed under a curse in the previous chapter of Genesis, whereas the descendants of Aber, the eponymous ancestor of the Hebrews, are placed under Shem, the favored son of Noah. Our archaeological and historical data tell us that ethnically, geographically, and linguistically, the ancient Israelites were an offshoot of the Bronze Age Canaanites. In the Table of Nations, however, the separation between the Canaanites and Hebrews helps to establish the adversarial relationship between Israel and Canaan that eventually became a significant part of Judea's national identity. Let's look at Canaan more closely. Canaan's offspring includes several distinct groupings. Sidon, a major Phoenician city, is singled out as the firstborn of Canaan and may indicate the Phoenicians as a whole. Next is Heth, which in this context probably refers to the Neo-Hittite kingdoms to the north of Phoenicia. After Sidon and Heth, we get the Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, and Hivites. These four names are part of a stereotyped list of the occupants of the Promised Land that is repeated throughout the Pentateuch and the Book of Joshua. There is no historical evidence for the Jebusites, Girgashites, and Hivites that tells us who they were or if they even existed. David M. Carr suggests that these names were added here secondarily to anticipate Joshua's conquest. Then we have the Arkites, Sinites, Arvadites, and Zemarites, which were a cluster of Phoenician cities to the north of Sidon. The inclusion of such specific cities that are relatively unimportant seems odd to me, and Professor Jan Christian Gerritz of Heidelberg University suggests that the author got these names from a list of trading partners. Lastly, we have Hamath, which also seems a bit out of place here since it was an Aramean kingdom, which ought to put it on Shem's branch of the tree. The lineage of Aram in the Table of Nations is also in tension with two other genealogies in Genesis. In Genesis 22, Nahor, Abraham's brother, becomes the patriarch of various Aramean clans. In that genealogy, Aram is the grandson of Nahor, rather than being the immediate offspring of Shem as he is in Genesis 10. Likewise, Uz is linked to the Arameans in both genealogies, but he is a son of Aram in Genesis 10 and an uncle of Aram in Genesis 22. Such differences illustrate how fluid biblical genealogies could be, with multiple traditions relating the same tribes and clans to each other in different ways. Uz is an interesting case, because in addition to its Aramean connections, it is also associated with Job and the Edomites. In Genesis 36, Uz is part of an Edomite genealogy and the brother of one Aaron, which may or may not be a misspelling of Aram. The same chapter mentions an Edomite king named Jobab, who is often equated with the biblical character Job. The book of Job, incidentally, tells us that Job was from the land of Uz. Jobab also appears in the Table of Nations among the Arabian descendants of Joktan. These specific examples show that the compilers of Genesis felt a close kinship with the Edomites and Arameans, and so places like Uz and Aram are deliberately linked to characters of Israelite legend like Abraham and Job through multiple genealogies, even though exactly how they are linked varies from one passage to the next. Another example of this genealogical fluidity concerns the brothers Sheba and Dedan. Sheba represents the Arabian kingdom of Saba in what is now Yemen, and Dedan was an Arabian oasis city on the incense route. In the priestly Table of Nations, they are both grandsons of Cush, but in the Awist Table of Nations, Sheba is one of the sons of Joktan in southern Arabia, making it a close relative to the Israelites. Furthermore, in Genesis 25, Sheba and Dedan are the sons of Jokshan, who is a son of Keturah, Abraham's third wife. It seems likely that Joktan and Jokshan are variants of the same name. In other words, Genesis gives us 3 different genealogies for Sheba and 2 for Dedan. This suggests that some, though not all, authors of Genesis viewed the Arabian kingdoms as close relatives of the Israelites and found various ways to express that kinship. The offhand mention of the Philistines in the Table of Nations is worth looking at. In the book of Amos, which was very likely written earlier than Genesis, we read, "Did I not bring Israel up from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir?" Jeremiah 47:4 also states that the Philistines came from Caphtor, and Caphtor is widely understood to be the Hebrew name for the Greek island of Crete. Genesis 10, however, says the following, "Egypt begat Casluhim, from whom the Philistines come, and Caphtorim." One immediately wonders why the Philistines have been attached to the Casluhim, an unknown people group, when Caphtorim, the obvious choice, was right there in the same sentence. Well, according to several scholars, this discrepancy is best explained if the Table of Nations originally did not mention the Philistines. At some point, a scribe who was familiar with Amos saw the name Caphtorim and added a note in the scroll margin that said, "From whom the Philistines come." Then another scribe who was making a new copy of Genesis inserted that note into the body of the text, but he put it in the wrong place, linking it to the Casluhim instead. This kind of scribal insertion is not unusual. In fact, it happens again in the same chapter. The city of Kala is followed by the phrase, "which is the great city," but scholars think that this remark was originally a marginal gloss that described the city of Nineveh. Nineveh is described by exactly the same phrase in Jonah 1:2. Here's something else interesting. If you add up all the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth listed in Genesis 10, you get exactly 70. The number 70 frequently represents the idea of totality in the Bible, and it shows up again in the 70 sons of Jacob in Genesis 46. The idea that the world consisted of 70 nations is well attested in ancient Jewish sources. The Table of Nations was almost certainly adjusted by a redactor to arrive at this exact number, and the need to pad the list in order to reach the number 70 could explain the odd inclusion of minor trading cities. There's also a mythological angle here. The religious texts of Ugarit attest to an ancient Canaanite belief that 70 gods were born to the high god El and his wife Asherah. Many scholars link that belief to the Table of Nations by noting that Deuteronomy 32:8 describes the nations as being divided among the sons of God, with Israel given to Yahweh. It's easy to see how the notions of 70 gods and 70 nations align quite nicely in this context. As Judaism became more monotheistic, these motifs evolved into the doctrine that there were 70 angels, each assigned to one of the 70 nations. Since the Table of Nations ostensibly describes the very earliest generations of humankind after the flood, we might expect these names to represent very old nations and people groups. It turns out, however, they reflect the geopolitical situation of the first millennium BCE. Here are a few examples. According to Egyptologist Donald Redford, the fact that Sidon is described as the firstborn of Canaan, while Tyre is not even mentioned, indicates a time when Sidon was dominant and Tyre was at a low point. The best historical fit is the period between the Babylonian siege of Tyre in 586 BCE and the fall of Sidon in 346. Redford also argues that the territorial range covered by Egypt's offspring precisely matches Egypt's sphere of influence during the Site period from 664 to 525. Madai represents the Medes, called Mada in Akkadian, who ruled much of the Near East from about 850 to 550. Sabteka, the son of Nubia, is thought to be a reference to the Nubian pharaoh Shabbataka, who ruled Egypt from about 702 to 690. The kingdom of Sheba, which appears twice in this genealogy, flourished as a regional power in the 7th and 6th centuries. Dedan was originally ruled by Sheba, but became an independent kingdom around the year 500. The South Arabian kingdom of Hadramaut, called Hadaram in Hebrew, was also a contemporary of Sheba and Dedan in the mid to late 1st millennium. A few years ago, a fascinating bronze inscription was found during an excavation in Yemen. This inscription dates to the time of King Yada il-Bayin, who ruled Sheba during the early 4th century BCE. It was produced by an emissary who went on a trade mission from Sheba, and it mentions by name Dedan, Gaza, Kition, Judah, Chaldea, and Ionia. Aside from Judah, every location on this mission from Sheba happens to occur in the Table of Nations, assuming that the biblical Arpachshad is correctly identified as Chaldea. That means we have a 4th century inscription whose geopolitical outlook is identical to that of Genesis 10. All this data suggests that the names in the Table of Nations came from a variety of sources dating from the 7th to the 4th century. On that basis, German scholar Thomas Hicke estimates that the final editing of the Table of Nations took place during the 4th century BCE. An even later date is not impossible. Russell Gamirkin has argued that the Table of Nations was finalized in the early 3rd century because Lydia was politically united with Mesopotamia and Syria at that time, which should explain its position under Shem instead of Japhet in the genealogy. Scholars have often remarked that the Table of Nations doesn't have any close parallels in Mesopotamian literature, unlike the stories of creation and the flood. However, there are some remarkable parallels among Greek literature, in particular, a text called the Catalogue of Women that was created as an appendix to Hesiod's Theogony. It dates to between 630 and 590 BCE. The Catalogue of Women was much longer than the Table of Nations, 5 books long in fact, but it performed a similar function. It used genealogies to show how the tribes and nations of the world, along with various legendary characters, had descended from a small number of progenitors, such as Deucalion and Pheronius. These genealogies were interspersed with various anecdotes and supplemental information, which again is much like how Genesis 10 is structured. Like the Table of Nations, the Hesiodic family tree is laid out according to ethnic and geographical affinity between different tribes and nations. For example, Magnus and Macedon, who represent the Magnesians and Macedonians, are described as brothers due to their geographical proximity. There is also significant overlap between the Greek and Hebrew genealogies. In the Catalogue of Women, for example, Egypt is founded by its eponymous ancestor Aegyptus, and the Arabs are descended from their ancestor Arabus. Some of the Greek names in the Catalogue of Women even reappear in the Bible, such as Iapetus, whose biblical equivalent is Japhet, and Ion, the eponymous ancestor of the Ionians, who appears as Javan in the Bible. In fact, it is often suggested by Bible scholars that the biblical Japhet, who represents the Greek world, could have been borrowed from Greek myth. Sometime after the Catalogue of Women was composed, the Greeks imported the flood myth from Mesopotamia and attached the role of the flood hero to Deucalion. In essence, then, Noah is like the Hebrew version of Deucalion, and he's even closely related to Japhet, just as Deucalion is related to Iapetus. Although surviving fragments of the Catalogue of Women do not mention the flood, it's clear from other Greek sources that Deucalion, the ancestor of the Greeks and other nearby peoples, was well established as the hero of the Greek flood myth by the early 5th century. In his book on ancient origin stories, Guy Darshan concludes that the Table of Nations belongs to a new genre of literature that emerged in the eastern Mediterranean toward the middle of the first millennium BCE. The parallels between the Table of Nations and the Catalogue of Women show that Greek and Israelite writers belonged to the same cultural continuum during that period of time. In summary, biblical genealogies cannot be read as literal accounts of historical individuals. This is especially true of the Table of Nations, which Hika describes as a fictional text that employs the categories of lineage and kinship as a representational means for arranging the existing world into a spatial order through narrative. This method of structuring historical narratives around genealogies developed in the eastern Mediterranean toward the middle of the first millennium BCE, and the notable parallels between Genesis and Greek literature show that the biblical authors knew many of the same traditions. But genealogies aren't simply derived from ethnic identities and relationships. As Jonathan M. Hall explains in his study of Greek myths, genealogies are actually one of the ways that ethnic identity is created and structured in the first place. When we read the genealogies of Genesis, we are peering back through time at the actual process by which Judeans forged their own identity in the late first millennium BCE. That the Jews of today still base their identity on these genealogies is a monumental testament to their effectiveness.
And these are the descendants of Cain. Enoch fathered Irad, and Irad fathered Mehushael. Mehushael fathered Methushael, who in turn fathered Lamech. Lamech married 2 women, Ada and Zillah. The second wife, Zillah, gave birth to Tubal-Cain, the craftsman, ancestor of all those who work with copper and all other metals.